This is Goku-san DBZ, and this is just a vlog video, and I thought I would discuss a little bit in honor of the upcoming, in less than 2 days now, release of the remaster of Final Fantasy VIII, my personal all-time favorite Final Fantasy game. I wanted to mention, talk about Final Fantasy as a whole, and I chose in the background music from the very first Final Fantasy game I ever played. Final Fantasy 3 on the Super Nintendo, aka Final Fantasy 6. Which, to this day, this game will always hold a special place in my heart. This is a superb masterpiece of a game. Then you have, of course, the tend to be highly overlooked Final Fantasy 2, aka Final Fantasy 4. 6, though, deserves its respect. The music is a masterpiece in my personal opinion, from 16-bit. The music is amazing. But as for why I think this is a big deal, Final Fantasy has had, definitely over the years, probably the most influential JRPG series of all time. Though we've gained many different types of Final Fantasy games over the years. Not just JRPGs anymore, like the old school, like the ones mentioned, or like my personal favorite, Final Fantasy VIII, which of course I really look forward to having the remaster version coming out of my all-time favorite game. Yes, Final Fantasy VIII is not just my favorite Final Fantasy or RPG, it's my favorite video game in general of all time. There's no game that will ever surpass as my favorite. Though, Final Fantasy VI, I will say, throughout the years, has come to probably, I would currently rank it my second favorite Final Fantasy game in the franchise as a whole. Definitely holds a special place. I have played until Final Fantasy VIII. I had played 2 Final Fantasy games prior to 8. This being the first. The second game I played in the Final Fantasy series was, strangely enough, Final Fantasy VII. I wouldn't play Final Fantasy 2, aka Final Fantasy 4, until a little bit later on the PS1, when it would be released, of course, in a double pack. Along with Chrono Trigger, actually, PS1 port would be a double pack together. Awesome double pack. But I, of course, ended up much later on wanting to get the Super Nintendo version of the game for my personal collection as a big uber fanatic and fan of the Final Fantasy series. In my opinion, the best JRPG franchise of all time. Now, over the years, I've somewhat become an even bigger fanboy of another franchise, namely Kingdom Hearts. Though Final Fantasy is my number 2 favorite game franchise of all time, and I never see that dropping. But for quite a long time, Final Fantasy was my favorite game franchise for well over a decade. But I'm curious, mention in comments, what is your personal favorite Final Fantasy game of all time? Who's your favorite Final Fantasy hero or Final Fantasy villain / antagonist? For me, my favorite Final Fantasy villain, I've gone back and forth throughout the years with the franchise as a whole. For me specifically, though, I understand where a lot of people love Sephiroth. He's a good character. I think he's overrated, personal opinion. But Final Fantasy VII version of Sephiroth is not bad, don't get me wrong, he's good. He's a good design character, I will say that. They made Sephiroth more interesting, though, with the prequel stuff and everything. They made him look more badass in the movie, of course, Advent Children, and also made him cool in Kingdom Hearts, which is one thing that helped him gain a little bit more appreciation for me was the version they chose for KH. Though I actually think my favorite interpretation and overall game-wise of Sephiroth is probably Final Fantasy VII Crisis Core, which is, to this day in my opinion, a criminally underrated RPG. Some people may hate me for this opinion, and that's fine. All well and good. Opinion, everyone has opinions. But for me personally, my all-time favorite, or rather Final Fantasy VII, fun fact, I like Final Fantasy VII Crisis Core more than regular Final Fantasy VII. I mean, I like the materia system better, mechanically speaking, than the interesting system they have implemented in Crisis Core, but still, in my opinion, Crisis Core is probably the best Final Fantasy game I've played, or rather, specifically designed for handheld in mind, I should say. But, I mean, there's a lot of great Final Fantasy games on handheld. I mean, for instance, even though it's a multi-platform game, still really good. Final Fantasy World. Now, this is an, of course, copy, obviously, I play, because this one's still factory sealed. But it's a good game, honestly. It's really fun, in my opinion. Eventually, I need to try get this on PS4 or Xbox One so I can record HD quality gameplay. Because I currently do not use specific types of software and stuff, obviously, for different reasons and stuff. Eventually, maybe. But I will say, I am happy also with the Vita. I think the Vita at least got some love from Square. And specifically, my personal favorite thing about the Vita is the HD port it got of course, Final Fantasy X, well, /10-2, though it's a digital copy of 10-2, though. To be specific, not a fan of Final Fantasy X-2, never was. I played the game all the way through, beginning to end, but I was sorely disappointed with the game, just because I didn't like the mechanics very much of the game, and overall, I didn't care much for all the pop music that they played in the game. I'm just not a fan. It completely different than Final Fantasy X, which Final Fantasy X itself is in my top 10, or rather top 5 favorite Final Fantasy games of all time in the franchise. I mean, there's a reason why I bothered to get the HD version on the Vita, as well as getting the HD version on the PS3, though I still need PS4 port. But, I mean, yes, this game holds a special place for me. It's hard to believe that that huge, massive game fits on this little tiny cartridge of Final Fantasy X. One thing I will say is, it is a superb game and definitely one of the best games in the franchise as a whole. And there's many, many Final Fantasy games. Though I like the fact over the years they have decided to evolve just from JRPGs. I mean, you have, for instance, Final Fantasy tactical games, such as Final Fantasy Tactics. Though I like the PSP port, War of the Lions is my personal favorite version. But that's because I currently don't have the PS1 version of Tactics, which I want to get. You have some good, more classic, if you want to go back to more old school Final Fantasy, on the DS, as well as on like the GameCube and stuff. You have great games like Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles series, which is honestly really good and an underrated branch-off series of Final Fantasy games, which I do highly recommend if you've never played the Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles series. But seriously, do play Final Fantasy Tactics. It's a great tactical RPG, and I think probably definitely one of the top 3 most underrated Final Fantasy games of the whole franchise. But I do like in recent years they decide to go a little bit more action-oriented, though at times it does feel weird. Especially more of an open world set in, of course, Final Fantasy 15. I do appreciate the beautiful artwork, though, in this case. But even though I like Final Fantasy 15, it's not my favorite game of the more recent time period. That honor goes to actually this, which actually went on my way to get the, obviously, collector's edition. But for me personally, in recent years, Final Fantasy Type 0 is probably my favorite Final Fantasy game I have played in well over a decade. I like this game more than Final Fantasy 15. Not a huge amount, but still, I like overall the game-wise more, and I like the selection of characters, and given you got 15 different characters you end up having, and given you also have special little different types of gameplay elements in like some of the missions and stuff that require more tactical approaches, I like that. There's just several things I like better about Type 0. Yeah, some of the voice work is not the greatest, but all well. I've learned through surviving the 1990s bad English work in video games and especially in anime that I'm used to by now, that kind of stuff. And one of the other things I like about this game specifically is, to my knowledge, it's the only M-rated Final Fantasy game ever released. Because there is actually a lot of blood in a lot of the cutscenes and things in this game. That's one thing that helps stand it apart from others. It's not as family-friendly oriented. One, from the blood and gore. Also, it does tend to cuss a little bit more than other Final Fantasy games. That's for sure. At least since more use and voice work. But for me personally, Final Fantasy will always hold a special place for me. And the series has always had great villains for the most part. And that's one thing I feel Final Fantasy 15 lacks a little of is the villains. I don't think they're as good. Yeah, some of the villains may not be great in Type 0, but I'd still like the villains a little bit better. Though you can't beat classic villains, honestly. Even though, like I said, Sephiroth is kind of overrated, I do think there's some superb villains, like in Final Fantasy VIII, for instance. Sorceress Ida, which you find out ends up just a puppet of the bigger Sorceress Ultimacia. As well as, of course, my all-time favorite villain from Final Fantasy VI. And, of course, that being Sephiroth. Yeah, sure. Kefka. Or, as I like to consider him, the Joker of Final Fantasy. That's the best way to describe. And unlike most villains in Final Fantasy franchise, about halfway through the game, he basically burns the entire planet. And basically, you have to get the team back together and basically save what is left of the planet. Just save the remnants that are left. So, anyways, this is just a little vlog reflection video I wanted to do and talk a little bit about my personal favorite JRPG franchise of all time, though there's so much now to the series as a whole. I mean, you have JRPGs, you have tactical RPGs, you have action RPGs, Western style RPGs, you have, heck, you even have like some Final Fantasy games that, of course, now more open world RPG like 15. Then you have MMOs like Final Fantasy XI and Final Fantasy XIV, which eventually someday I need to try Final Fantasy XIV out. I just barely remember years ago playing a little bit of Final Fantasy XI on the 360. But that was a long time ago, unfortunately. So with that said, as I've said before, Leave a comment below. Tell me, what are your personal favorite Final Fantasy games? Who's your favorite characters in the Final Fantasy lore and mythology of everything? But in the end, I think we can all agree on one thing, and that is, as fans of Final Fantasy, definitely have to give a lot of appreciation where it's due. As a whole, where would RPG video games be today if it wasn't for Final Fantasy? Final Fantasy really paved the way, especially in Western cult markets and stuff. In Japan, yeah, they did have some big massive things, like Dragon Quest series, which actually predates Final Fantasy, fun fact, which was done by a little company called Enix. And Square would see things that Enix did and would end up creating the Final Fantasy series. And I appreciate we got over the years a lot of great iconic characters in gaming history from Final Fantasy. Heroes. And if it wasn't for Final Fantasy, Kingdom Hearts would never exist. Not to mention, we would have never gotten some of the most awesome music ever. Also, we may have never gotten great game creators such as, well, how should I put this? Also, we wouldn't have gotten masterpiece music from artists such as the Black Mages. And in case you don't know who the Black Mages are, do a little research and listen to the music. It's a masterpiece. But, with that said, I'll see everyone next time here in YouTube land. Same YouTube time, same YouTube channel, and stay tuned for an upcoming movie review. Which is going to be the review of Pokemon Detective Pikachu. I put up a thing last week, and Pokemon was the only one that got any votes. So, Detective Pikachu will be the film that I will be doing a review of. But I'll see you then. And I hope everyone has a good week out in YouTube land and a good September, since it's the beginning of September. Anyways, I'll cut this vlog off for now.